Chapter 7 A New Trespass. Gaara's feet tapped against the polished stone floor in a steady drum as the frequency removed any distinction in his footfalls. The air in the castle was noticeably cooler after he'd spent the day in the amply heated Gryffindor common room, but his growing discomfort was pretty inconsequential seeing as he now apparently had a shy canine stalker to investigate. The dog, no matter why it was there or who it belonged to, was definitely trying to evade him, as every few minutes it would turn its head to glance back at him and then dart around another corner, as if it was trying to outmaneuver him. Gaara would have sent his sand out to snatch the dog off the ground, but experience told him that often didn't end well for smaller organisms with weaker bones. He might have been able to catch up a lot quicker were it not for the labyrinthine design of the castle giving the nimble hound the advantage with its tight turns. Every time Gaara came close to the thing's tail, it would disappear around a corner and Gaara would have to skirt around after it. A subtle satisfied smirk eased its way onto Gaara's face after he turned another corner and saw the long stretch of corridor in front of him and the dog, ending in what appeared to be a stairwell. Gaara had never had a dog before. Yasham, are you having intended to buy him a puppy if he was still sane in a few years, but he was pretty sure that a dog this size needed to slow down before they went downstairs. This chase was over. Giving one last push, Gaara burst forward and leapt at the still fleeing dog. The pooch had turned its head again, to check if Gaara was still following it, and this time it saw the looming figure of Gaara as he fell down on top of it. The pair of them tumbled onwards a few more feet until Gaara was holding the dog's midsection tightly, hoping it would calm down soon before he succumbed to the smell. This wasn't wet dog, this was more like the stink of rotting dog. Even strays shouldn't smell this bad. Even Fluffy, three-headed monstrosity that he was, didn't smell at all bad compared to this smelly mutt. The big black dog continued to struggle and thrash about in Gaara's arms for a little while before slowing to stillness. Gaara sighed a little, until the dog began to shift again, but it wasn't panicky like before. The warm mass he was kneeling against, arms around the middle, moved in a fluid way that didn't seem at all organic until he felt something circle his own abdomen. Confused, wondering how the emaciated beast had twisted itself into such a grapple, Gaara looked down to see not the bent ears and furry snout he had been chasing, but the long hair and smiling, earnest face of Sirius Black, infamous mass murderer and inventor of the world's most effective hangover potion, patent pending. Before he'd known what was happening, he was being hugged back by Sirius, and Gaara was more than a little surprised to see Sirius here, in his arms. The pause Gaara had taken to stare down at Sirius' beaming face ended when he realized that surprise wasn't the right reaction for this situation. Indignity was what he should be experiencing. With that in mind, he let go of Sirius and stood up abruptly, letting his friend fall to the ground with a thud and an oomph. "Nice to see you too, Gaara." Gaara waited until Sirius had righted himself and stalked off to the nearest empty storeroom to have a little chat. He had a few questions. Safely sequestered, Gaara watched the frail man hold himself against the cold in the castle and considered him. He hadn't known that wizards could transform into animals, but now that he thought about it, it made sense that magic could do something like transformations. Then Gaara wondered how Sirius had known that he was hiding in Gryffindor while everyone was away. It was bizarre. Biting back against the cold that his meager rags did little to protect him against, Sirius smiled and said, "I'm glad to see you. How are you doing, Gaara?" Gaara shrugged. Sirius' sunken cheeks stretched further upwards, seeing that Gaara's demeanor hadn't changed one iota, even after the fugitive had snuck into the castle in the middle of the day and had revealed that he was an animagus. "What are you doing here?" Sirius hadn't missed having to read through his conversations with Gaara. In his memories, Gaara seemed to speak without moving his lips. At this particular question, Sirius deflated a little. His already listless shoulders drooped even further, and he admitted to Gaara that had grown tired of waiting for Lupin to find the rat and had decided to do something for himself, for a change. Gaara's eyes widened a fraction and he realized that he had just happened to be in the wrong common room when Sirius broke in. Talk about coincidences. So, how did you turn into a dog? You don't have a wand. Oh, that. Do you know what animagi are? Gaara shook his head and Sirius marveled at the redhead's ability to remain so stoic when confronted with the inexplicable and strange, even by wizarding standards. Well, an animagus is a witch or wizard who has learned a special sort of magic to turn into an animal. Once they know how to do it, they can transform even without a wand. To tell you the truth, that's how I got out of Azkaban. Are you the same dog I met in Hogsmeade? Sirius wished Gaara's face was made out of flesh and bone rather than stone and with erring glares, because telling if he was angry about that whole episode or not was impossible. The only thing for it was the truth, and the hope that Gaara was willing to overlook whatever rudeness Sirius hadn't bothered to notice. Even Sirius knew he was lying to himself. He was aware he'd obviously crossed the line, but any chance Sirius got he took to get out of that shack. If he had to spend much longer in that creaky damned house, the shrieking it was famous for might just resume. Yeah, I wanted to get some fresh air and didn't see any harm. You really know the right spot to scratch behind my ear. The tick mark was actually reassuring to see on Gaara, since the boy usually externalized his anger in only one of two ways: physical violence and emotional displays of anger. The latter were rarer but oh so sweet. Forgiveness. It wouldn't occur to Sirius for a few months that his dynamic with Gaara would often flip to where he was the child and Gaara was the angry adults scolding him. Gaara asked a little about how he was doing out there in the cold, and then about tonight. Sirius explained how he'd been cold and hungry and had snuck into the school through one of the hidden passages with a plan to find Peter and finish this arc of his life. He'd be acquitted and he could set himself up in society again and by a dozen stakes. Gaara was following him up until the point where Sirius admitted to stopping by the kitchens on the way to Gryffindor to get a bite to eat. He wouldn't have believed anybody else if they said that. Now that I think about it, why were you in the Gryffindor common room today? Gaara blanked him for a few moments, coming up with a story, unbeknownst to Sirius, and then wrote out I was there for the same reason as you. Searching for Pettigrew. While the students were in Hogsmeade. Oh, good thinking. Just what I'd expect. Sirius bellowed, clapping his hands. I know it must be difficult, what Remus told me about your home, but thank you for thinking about my situation. Did you have any luck? Sirius didn't sound too hopeful, knowing that Gaara probably wouldn't have let him carry on without mentioning finding Peter. The ragged convict was about to ask about Gaara, how he'd been doing, but Gaara held up his hands for silence and Sirius was still in admonished child mode and hushed up immediately. They're coming. Sirius was disappointed and afraid, but Gaara opened the door and motioned for him to follow. Sirius wasted no time and jogged behind Gaara as they made their way to the nearest exit. Sirius could find a way out of the school's perimeter soon enough. When they reached the ground floor, Gaara opened a window and stepped back for Sirius to go through. He was about to, but he saw Gaara fiddling with something and then Gaara's outermost layers came loose and were held out to Sirius, who wasn't shivering but shaking in gratitude, and maybe a little cold. Gaara. For me. Gaara pushed the cloaks at him and pointed out the window, already walking away, towards the voices that he'd heard and that had apparently followed him. I'll see you again, Lily, soon. Sirius jumped out into the snow and started off running towards the Homping Willow and back to his temporary home. He'd rather sit down for tea with that portrait his mother had commissioned. Gaara meanwhile was walking back towards the voices of Lupin, McGonagall and a collection of student voices that he didn't recognize. When they came into sight, both the adults and a couple of the mature students were pointing their wands right at him. Lupin called out for everyone to hold their fire, but his raised voice caused a particularly jittery seventh year to fire off whatever curse he'd been muttering, right at Gaara. His sand blocked it with ease, but the fear evident of the seventh year's face made it clear that he dearly wanted to raise his wand again to defend against this imminent threat. Fortunately, Gaara saved himself any further curses by avoiding the weary glare he wanted to send at the fearful student, and instead walked slowly forward, knowing that most of the students considered him little better than Sirius Black, which he would argue against for very different reasons. Among the group he noticed most of the students crowding around him, and the teachers as he had approached were Slytherins, and among them was Draco looking concerned and relieved. Honestly, even if Sirius was a reputed mass murderer, Gaara was way more infamous where he came from. 13 people. Please. Gaara, where have you been? McGonagall crossed her arms and he realized that whatever inquisition he'd be getting would happen right here. His sand went as slowly as he could manage it, as to not instigate any more accidental magic or pant-sweating. I was chasing someone. I think it was Sirius Black. He got away. A gasp went around the crowd, including Minerva, who covered her mouth. You chased after Sirius Black? What on earth could have prompted you to do something so foolish? Do you know how dangerous that man is? McGonagall looked more angry than worried, so Gaara got a little confused about why she was shouting at him. An older student stepped forwards, with a calculating look in his eye that was terribly misleading because he was actually a Gryffindor prefect, not a Slytherin. Professor, apparently Gaara was seen running away from the entrance to the Gryffindor common room. Are we sure it wasn't him that slashed the painting? All eyes turned to Gaara, even Remus's, which looked more tired than even he was prone to. I was already in the common room. I sat by the fire all day. There were a few scattered gasps and one of the minority of Gryffindors in the crowd exclaimed, "Wait, that was him?" It soon became clear that Gaara had indeed spent the better part of the day in the opposing house's private area, since he'd been seen and he could account for some of the day's foot traffic. It was finally McGonagall who asked why he had been in there in the first place, and Gaara looked around quickly, wondering either what to say or how to escape. Visibly annoyed to have to answer, he wrote out, "I was cold. It's warmer in there." More than a few among the crowd, especially those who had actually dealt with Gaara before, face-palmed. Draco finally piped up. If Gaara really had anything to do with Black, surely he would have just let him in and stopped him from alerting everyone in the castle. Besides, Gaara would have known that Potter wasn't there anyway. It was precisely for times like these that Gaara's friendship with Draco became worthwhile. I think that should allay everyone's suspicions regarding Gaara's whereabouts today, Lupin said with a nervous little smile, a cold sweat making its way down the side of his face. The full moon had been only yesterday and he really didn't need this sort of drain. Stupid Sirius. Be that as it may, it is still against the rules to trespass in other houses, and so I will be taking 50 points from Slytherin. A chorus of groans rose from the Slytherin students gathered. But I hardly think it's the right time to be standing around debating, when there could still be a wanted criminal roaming the halls. I think we'd best continue onwards to the Great Hall. No one argued against the aged lioness, and followed quietly behind her, with Professor Lupin walking at the back of the crowd. Gaara fell into step with Draco and his small band of friends, not engaging or taking notice of the conversations around him. All of the students present were laden with bags of varying sizes, having come straight from Hogsmeade when they were intercepted on their way down to the dungeons by the professors. The combined group had taken a longer route through the castle to pick up any stragglers still unaware of the dangers. Draco glanced over to the red-headed bane of his peaceful school year and he marveled at the audacity it took to brazenly stroll into their rival house and spend the day reading in front of their fire. It was beyond his logic, that's what it was. However, as much as Draco wanted to be angry at the betrayal of his house, or incredulous at the simplicity it took to blindly seek out the warmest spots in the castle, the platinum blonde struggled to hold on to any of it. For one, Gaara was just that kind of boy, and Draco could also guess that his roommate might have been feeling a little homesick, with the weather conditions so alien to a desert dweller like him. Maybe he could talk to the maintenance staff about warming up their bedroom, or getting one of the higher years to perform a long-lasting, powerful warming charm. Hell, in the summer holidays he could always splurge and send Gara to Egypt for a couple of weeks. It was dirt cheap for wizards to stay in the desert country. Still, he'd have to look into organizing something like that. Hell, while he was at it, maybe he could find out where Gara came from, maybe take him back there for a visit or something. Draco walked along, embarrassed by his surprisingly dim friend and making summer plans instead of quivering in fear at the mass murderer. He would have told anyone that cared to ask, which was no one at the moment, that this was just because he was perfectly unaffected by such menial troubles. Of course, anyone who actually knew Draco would have seen through that lie. The truth was that he wasn't afraid of Sirius Black, and not just because Gara was the most convenient bodyguard a friend could ask for. Either Black was guilty of his crimes and he was loyal to the Dark Lord, in which case he'd be an ally of the Malfoy family, or he was innocent and didn't kill people. Plus Black was a relative of his mother's, he believed, so he had that going for him. He was pretty certain that as long as he gave Potter a wide berth, about the radius of a good-sized explosion spell, then he was pretty safe. Draco hadn't taken into account that residents of Azkaban habitually went insane within a few years of incarceration, and his first cousin once removed might not be in the right mind to distinguish enemy from allied family and friends. The doors to the Great Hall were being guarded by Professors Snape and Flitwick, with wands in hand and nervous eyes. Well, Flitwick's eyes were certainly nervous, Snape's were edging towards eager. He was probably praying that Sirius was stupid enough to approach him so he could finish many of his sadistic little fantasies regarding his tormentors. Severus' eyes hardened when he spotted Gara among the crowd of Slytherins and other assorted students. That's the last of them that we could find. I will continue searching the school with Remus, but I think Black has more than likely already fled the castle by now. Lock the doors after us, would you, Severus? McGonagall shepherded the students into the bustling hall and walked back out of the closing doors, which were then locked with what looked to be a pretty elaborate locking mechanism. A locking mechanism that assuredly wouldn't stand up to Gara's sand if he found out that the teachers did spot Sirius inside the school again and he had to race the staff to kill the idiot. Stopping for dinner? At least Lupin had looked appropriately chagrined by all of this. It seemed few people understood the burden of dealing with Sirius Black. If only Sirius was just a simple mass murderer, it would make his life so much easier. Plus they'd have something in common. The entire student body looked to be in a quiet panic about this latest trespass by Black, their previously safe haven now appearing scary and foreign to them. They all huddled in little groups and whispered and shook, the first years even occasionally breaking into tears and having to hide it from their friends. A few wary glances were sent to Gara, but for once he got to experience what it was like not to be the scariest thing on people's minds, though that waned a little as word spread that he'd either been in cahoots with Black, or had been scary enough to ward off the right-hand man of Voldemort. The festive floating jack-o'-lanterns had been taken down in light of the sufficiently terrifying events of the night, and the atmosphere of the Halloween feast, which Gara had totally and completely forgotten about, was ruined for a third year in a row. What were the chances? First a troll in the dungeons, then a bloody message on the wall, and now a mass-murdering psychopath breaking into the school. A few of the students began to wonder what could possibly go wrong next year to top this year. In place of the tables that had been laden with sweet foods and even sweeter confectionaries, now stood row upon row of cots ready for the students to finish off this horrifying night with a horrible night's sleep. Gara wondered, as he wandered through the rows, why they couldn't have just conjured up some more comfortable beds. Were they running low on magic juice? Did magic run out? Gara hadn't really thought about it. All around him the students continued their excited chatter and Gara lost his train of thought as Draco finished up his quick conversation with his other friends and jogged back over to him, brandishing a sizable bag that he'd pulled out of his rucksack. "Here, I thought this might cheer you up since you weren't allowed down into Hogsmeade." Gara was touched by the thought, until he saw it was a large sack of sweets. Not wanting to upset Draco or seem ungrateful, he nodded his insincere thanks, gave him a pat on the shoulder and took his bag of candy in hand and retired to his cot, which he'd selected because it was the furthest cot in the corner and was the least likely to upset the surrounding campers. He was a stoic boy, but most of the others in the hall were scared civilian children, and the last thing they needed was the sand-wielding bogeyman sleeping amidst them. He'd been walking across the hall with only his cot in mind, so that he could set down his bag of unwanted sweets and perhaps forget to take them with him the next morning, but on his way to the drafty corner he ran into a face he thought he recognized somewhat. Apparently Gara was familiar with her, though he couldn't remember her name as she strode up to him with that same empty-headed smile she'd had the last time. It was a strange name, something like Moon, or Luke. No, that wasn't it. Loon? Oh, wait, it was Luna. That girl who'd been bullied. "Hello again, Gara, how are you?" she said. Maybe she thought they were friends? Strange. Still, blank-faced, he nodded his general acceptance of life and the world around him before nodding at her, asking the same question, or at least that what she took it to mean. She told of how those girls had since left her alone and how she'd been pleasantly surprised by the amount of work her second year had brought her. All the while, Gara was totally ignorant as to why this girl, that he met once, to their knowledge, was acting so familiar. It didn't occur to Gara for a moment that to her he was like an old friend, because he was one of the few people in the school that didn't openly mock or shoot down her ideas, theories, and had in fact helped her when others had been routinely bullying her. Gara was strange and so was she, and so she continued to talk to Gara, having been wanting to catch up for a while. Dazed for a moment, Gara noticed the weight in his hand and his eyes locked onto the sack of unwanted sweets and then roamed back up to meet with the glassy grey eyes, and he figured that this was as good a use as he was going to get out of Draco's gift, so he reached into the sack, grabbed a sizable handful of candies and held them out for Luna to take. It stopped her speech eventually, as she took notice that Gara wasn't just standing there with that same impossible featureless expression on his face. She looked closer at whatever he was clutching in his hand, and when she saw what it was, she smiled widely and thanked him profusely before depositing all but one into her pockets and starting on the first of her treasured gifts. Giving her another nod, both in parting and in thanks for understanding that he would not have appreciated a hug for the sweets, Gara turned around and continued on his way to his bed so he could relax marginally and open his current book. He didn't bother turning around when he heard Luna, who was now sucking on the hard-boiled candy, following him sedately and all the while quietly telling him all about the wonderful and fictional creatures that either definitely or may live in the castle. He sat down on the most remote cot in the great hall, pulled out his book and began to read. Luna, meanwhile, took this as no kind of brush-off, as Ravenclaws like her often multitasked and read while others were talking. Everyone seemed to do something else when she talked. Intensely ignoring her as he was, Gara paid no mind when Luna casually began discussing, quite one-sidedly, the focus of her latest research project, the strange creature she'd chased around the school on the night of the full moon. If he had been paying attention, he might have had a hard time playing ignorant and not scowling at her when she described the thing as an abnormally large, sandy-colored red panda of some sort. Apparently she thought his tanuki form and the red pandas looked similar. Oblivious as they both were, one engaged with his book and the other engaged with her new good friend. Neither noticed the startled jump and gasp of Ginevra Weasley, who was stood close to the middle of the hall, surrounded by a group of other second-year girls. "What's the matter, Ginny?" one of the girls asked. "I'll be back in a second," Ginny replied absently, not looking back to the other as she had already begun walking quickly towards her friend and the imminent threat that her friend was talking to. Knowing Luna, she probably didn't know the stories about Gara and how violent he was. With how annoying Luna could be, It was a wonder that Gaara hadn't already gone for her, since the blonde was chattering at full speed into his ear while he was trying to read. She was almost jogging by the time she came to the end of the hall that was conspicuously empty except for Gaara and his conversational companion. Luna was reciting the different avenues of research she had tried in classifying her newest imaginary creature, when she was abruptly pulled to her feet and swung behind a ginger girl her own height. Gaara had noticed the fast-approaching girl but didn't think it was worth looking away from his book. He did glance up when the girl had reached them and pulled a surprised Luna behind her protectively. The look on the girl's freckled face said it all: fear, anger, and courage. Looks that promised to cause him even more trouble. He again bemoaned his magnetic attraction to trouble. It was one thing to constantly get into trouble in his own world, where he was a warrior and a murderous demon host, but in this world where he was a, supposedly, harmless child in a school surrounded by other children, it was unbelievable. "Hello Ginny, how are you?" Luna seemed oblivious, as usual, to Ginny's alarmed stance and protective position. "Stay there, Luna. Gaara's dangerous. He attacked Harry and Professor Snape, and he killed a boggart." She was panicked. That didn't bode well. Gaara had stopped reading, after finishing the sentence, marked his place in the surprisingly interesting tome and looked up at the disruptive pair of girls. He was glad to see that the redhead hadn't drawn her wand, as that would have surely led to a short battle followed by a long riotous frenzy among the inhabitants of the hall. "He's been very kind to me, Ginny. Are you sure you've got the right Gaara? He even gave me some sweets. Would you like one?" Luna reached into her pockets and retrieved one to give to her friend, who was still glaring at Gaara uninterrupted. Ginny refused it. Whether it was because it was from Gaara or because she was in the middle of a standoff, it was hard to tell. Finally she addressed the accused. "Why were you in Gryffindor today? I heard you were in there all day. Were you waiting for Harry to come back? Were you going to attack him again?" Gaara wasn't really sure how to answer any of these questions, so he sat quietly and tried not to look angry or aggressive at all. Hopefully Luna or someone would step in before this girl did something stupid. And why would he spend all day in one room waiting to start a fight with someone he'd already beaten? The people in the outermost social circles, who were closest to the Gaara exclusion zone, were privy to what Ginny considered to be a long overdue chewing out. Ginny wasn't raised to be hateful. She came from a tolerant and loving family, but she really hated bullies. Especially when those bullies went after her Harry. "I'm not going to just let you attack my friends and get away with it." People further afield had started to turn and watch the spectacle. "I think bullies are despicable." Gaara didn't know when he'd attacked Luna, nor when he'd become a bully, but it didn't seem fair. Ginny looked very upset and Luna was beginning to look a little concerned. Suddenly, Ginny let go of Luna's wrist, stepped forward and shouted, "Leave my friends alone." And she slapped Gaara. A gasp rose in symphony from the collected watchers and doubled when they all saw the small sand shield that had blocked Ginny's attack. At the other side of the expansive hall, Harry, Ron and Hermione all started to running through the crowds toward Ron's little sister. Ginny had frozen, the adrenaline from her aunt suddenly deserting her and leaving nothing but cold sweat in its place as she realized that the psychopathic boy that had fought the boy who lived, Albus Dumbledore, and Professor Snape, who had killed Boggart's sand, if the rumors were true, Dementors, and had used his sand control to attack each time, was also the boy she had just tried to slap across the face. Suddenly the sand, deceptively soft, that her hand was still lightly touching against, retracted and then retreated into the gourd on Gaara's back without any kind of offensive action. Ginny slowly, dazedly moved her hand back down and backed away from Gaara, never blinking or breaking eye contact for fear of breaking whatever peaceful spell had come over the terrifying Gaara. The spell was broken for Ginny when Gaara shifted to pick up his book again and started to read, totally ignoring her. The crimson-haired boy had thought about saying something to her, but he figured it would have less of an impact if she had to read what he wanted to say in his defense. It wasn't often that Gaara wished he to speak, or at all, as of the last few months, but increasingly of late he had found situations where the right words here or there would have helped his situation enormously. With Gaara distracted again, Ginny took Luna by the hand again and dragged her back to the safety of the other side of the hall, where Ginny was worried over by both Ron and the twins while Luna continued to suck on her sweets and try to work out exactly what had led to that confrontation. She was also a little upset that Ginevra had tried to slap Gaara unprovoked, but then she was probably just being affected by an excess of Raxpert's making her do silly things for no reason. Things in the Great Hall quietened down greatly after that, and the cots began to fill up as the teachers began the long procedure of making the Wizarding World's largest slumber party go to sleep. Meanwhile, the children were all sat quietly talking amongst themselves from atop their beds for the night, and even the ones nearest Gaara felt brave and continued their own hushed conversations. Gaara felt, as he always did, the unwavering glances from the boys nearest to him, and in a moment of inspiration, he set his book face down and turned to find the bag of sweets he'd hidden from himself. Looking up and around, he saw the largest cluster of teenagers huddled around on their cots, whispering excitedly, so he stood up and padded over to them. He was almost upon them when the ones facing his direction saw him and froze mid-speech, causing the other boys to turn around and freeze too. The mix of Ravenclaws and Hufflepuffs were not the bravest and were among the vast majority of the school that outright feared the entity that was Gaara, so his unprompted approach in the middle of the night just before lights out was somewhat startling. Gaara held out the sack to the closest boy and waited. It took a little while for the boy to both clock onto what was expected of him and to actually take the proffered sack from Gaara. The boy had expected any number of things to be contained within the sack, most of which being nightmarish and inexplicable, but he was surprised beyond words to find a large stash of good quality confectionaries from Honeydukes. The fearful boy looked up at his scary benefactor, but Gaara had already turned to go back to his bunk. He was free of the sweets, he'd done a good deed that might help to clear some of the miasma around his name, and he'd given tons of sugar to a bunch of school kids just before their bedtime with only a few overstretched adults to supervise the resulting sugar-rushing mess. Worth it. Wary of this new and unknown, kind Gaara, the collected students did indeed begin to share out the sweets and called over a chorus of thanks before all ducking down a little when McGonagall shushed them harshly. Gaara sat back on his cot, cross-legged, and settled in for a long night. He only had this one book to read and he was already halfway through to finishing it. If he'd known his day of lounging in Gryffindor would have extended to include the entire night on an uncomfortable bed surrounded and exposed to hundreds of others, he might have packed a few more books or some of his homework to do since he wouldn't be going to sleep anytime soon. Draco had elected to stay with the Slytherins over on the other side of the hall, owing to a particularly riveting discussion of their upcoming Quidditch match and the season at large. He'd seen the tense standoff, but he hadn't had a chance to move over there before the whole thing had resolved itself. He always tried to keep an eye on Gaara, since the boy was so very foreign in so many of his ways and was prone to doing stupid things. It was with these same vigilant eyes that he also noticed the astounding act of generosity on Gaara's part after everyone had begun to settle down towards their cots. The wannabe aristocrat of Slytherin was torn between annoyance at his own act of benevolence and charity being cast aside and re-gifted, to be consumed by ravenous younger years from different houses. On the other hand, Draco could plainly see that Gaara was attempting to buy these students favor with the confections. Such a Slytherin move. Draco was so proud. Draco was so delusional. Not long after he'd sat back down to read, the teachers patrolling the hall called out that Black had not been found in the school but the search would continue overnight, and that it was now time to go to bed. Minerva raised her wand and flicked it, blowing out every one of the floating candles, and not a drop of wax was spilt on a student. Gaara marveled. It was a stroke of luck that, though dim, the hall was lit enough by the light of the stars and the full moon through the invisible ceiling that Gaara was still able to read. He dreaded to think about how strained his eyes would be by the morning, though. As he read, he began to think on a number of recurring issues he'd been considering, like a new source of sand and when he'd next get a chance to visit Sirius. A number of close-by students, excepting those that had received the sweets and goodwill from Gaara, noticed that the world's shortest insomniac wasn't going to sleep, nor did he appear to have any intention to do so. The redhead was visible in the moonlight, sat stiffly on his bed with a book on his lap, and those that saw his unblinking eyes found themselves fighting to stay awake as well. It seemed perilous to fall asleep when Gaara was in the same room as them and not planning on succumbing to slumber as well. No one was in a position to laugh at the fact that Gaara was just as afraid of sleeping amongst them as they were of doing so in front of him. The only mirth to be had was Gaara's silent smile as he saw the cluster of boys breathing even out one by one as they each lost in their attempt at the Olympic waking event. He was the undisputed champion. It only took him another couple of hours to finish his book, before he carefully and quietly closed it and slid it under his cot and laid back. He stared up at the sky and wondered at some of the forms that magic could take. There was so much glitz and glamour, and curses and hexes, but the simple spell of seeing the stars and bright round moon through the ceiling of this school was really wonderful. He stayed still and stared up into the sky for a while longer before anything else happened. The teachers, now that the last of the students had settled down to sleep, by appearance only for one, had started to wander through the aisles of children and softly converse about the day's events, as if they weren't surrounded by hundreds of nosy children, at least one of which was prone to insomnia. It was as Gaara waited for the morrow, that he heard the distinctive Scottish whispering of Professor McGonagall. "There's been no sign of him, but I am still not convinced it's safe for the students to remain here for much longer. Sirius Black has proven that he's capable of breaking out of and into both Azkaban prison and Hogwarts, and there's no denying that he was violent. Look at the way he threatened the house elves in the kitchen, and that was all over a sandwich." Gaara just about stifled his groan and managed to cover his face palm by turning over and pretending to be shifting in his sleep, as was his disbelief and bemusement at the incredibly stupid things friends of his got up to. Was there something about him that attracted idiots to him? At least Draco was a little more mature, though some of his idiotic rivalries and behaviors still gave cause for doubt. Gaara was many things, but humble really wasn't one of them. His movement, innocuous though it was, apparently drew the adults' attention to him. Snape turned to Minerva and Albus and sneered in true form. "Was there ever a doubt in your mind that Black was up to no good? Even before he did away with Pettigrew, he was rotten to the core. When I mentioned inside help, I didn't just mean the obvious suspect among our own ranks. Does anybody else find it suspicious that just a little while after Sirius Black escapes Azkaban, an undeniably suspicious and unaccountable child is found wandering in the village close to the school that Sirius Black has now broken into, and that this same boy is the one that was involved in the incident concerning Black earlier this evening? How do we know that he didn't at least help Black escape the castle, if not helping him to enter in the first place?" It was chilling that Snape had stayed so quiet while he was angrily ranting, so cold. "Severus, you really must try to find some forgiveness in yourself, especially for one of your own. All of those grudges will fester." Minerva sounded more like a teacher admonishing a student rather than an irate colleague arguing with an unreasonable man. "Well," he drawled, "you're more than welcome to take him off my hands, if you think you could do better for him than me. What do you say?" He clearly had a big bitter smile on his face from the smarm in his voice, almost certainly stretching upwards when he was met by no answer. Before McGonagall could shamefully refuse to take Gaara into Gryffindor, Dumbledore spoke in his own whispering voice. "Now, Severus, Minerva, you both know you can't just up and trade your students. Not anymore." The slow footsteps finally took the three teachers out of earshot, and Gaara found that he did actually feel a little insulted that the usually magnanimous Minerva McGonagall hadn't been willing to, at least in principle if not practice, take him into her house. The collected professors were none the wiser that they had just been eavesdropped upon. nor that they would then walk over to where Harry Potter would be able to hear Snape's next theory, that both Gara and another within the castle, Remus Bloody Lupin, were in on the break-in, though without mentioning either by name. Still, it was enough for Harry to consider Gara with a little more suspicion than hostility from then on. The next morning, the students were released from lockdown to return to their dormitories and prepare for the day while the cots were switched out for the tables again, in time for breakfast. Relief abounded when it was announced that Sirius Black had not been found lurking in the castle overnight and that security had been stepped up, but the tension was still high for the upper years and a select few in the lower ones that felt the ongoing threat more acutely. Gara overheard Harry Potter, as they were leaving the Great Hall, say to his female friend, "They didn't find the basilisk either." Gara knocked lightly on the door, trying not to disturb the teacher that looked suspiciously hungover. "Oh, Gara, good afternoon. Is this one of your free periods too?" Lupin sat up straight and managed to push himself to his feet without making too much guilt-inducing noise. Gara nodded and entered the classroom. He'd been waiting all day for the time to come and relay what happened the night before. "I gather you saw a dangerous and stupid escaped convict last night. What happened?" Gara sighed a little and uncorked his sand. "He snuck in as a dog, to steal the rat. The painting stopped him and I chased him. I helped him to sneak out of the castle." Gara figured the bare bones would suffice until Lupin had a chance to go and find out directly from Sirius what had happened, after lengthily chewing him out, probably. Stupid, arrogant, self-absorbed. Lupin's headache didn't stop him from grumbling with all he was worth, growling out the string of insults that included a few barely audible ones that the seasoned shinobi had never heard before. Lupin closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, trying to calm himself down before he ran out into the snow and hunted down the idiot himself. Gara could blame him as the impulse was hard to resist. Gara actually had to hold Lupin back after he told him about Sirius' initial stop-off at the kitchens for a spot of dinner before searching for their friend's betrayers. Trying to distract the teacher from doing what he too wanted to go out and do to their mutual friend, Gara asked him, "What did you do yesterday?" It might also forestall any further judgments on how the cold redhead had spent his day. Lupin took a moment to register the words presence and then another to absorb them before he could turn to Gara with a smile on his weary face and say, "Harry came to see me yesterday, since he wasn't allowed to go and visit Hogsmeade with everyone else." For the first time in weeks, Lupin was displaying some vitality that wasn't well-aimed aggression towards Sirius. He said he wanted to know about his parents, about James and Lily. It was nice to be able to tell him about them. "He looks so much like James, it's very strange for me, and he has Lily's kindness. He got the best of both, you could say, James' looks and Lily's personality. Honestly, sometimes I struggle separating Harry from my memory of James. I keep expecting him to tell me to hurry up and get Sirius and Peter so we can go and make some mischief. I suppose that might be the reason that Severus has such a problem with Harry. I'm ashamed to admit we gave him a hard time when he were younger." Gara wondered what, then, was the reason for Snape's outright animosity towards him. Did Lily, Harry's mother, join you in bullying Professor Snape? He apparently looked an awful lot like this Lily person, enough, at least, to keep reminding him about the similarity, but the look on Lupin's face said that he was wrong. Lupin had creased his brow in thought as he was clearly trying to find the right way to say something. No, that's certainly not right. In fact, Lily was usually the one that told us off for bullying Severus. Lupin clearly didn't like to think of his childhood teasing as anything that serious, but the man did know that what he and his friends had done was wrong. Lily and Severus Snape used to be friends, a long time ago. They had a falling out, but Lily was unquestionably kind to everyone. I'm not 100% sure why Severus, Professor Snape has taken such a disliking to you, but I really don't think that it is because of her. Well, that was disappointing. He thought he finally had that one pinned down. Lupin and Gara talked for a little longer about Harry and his parents until Draco poked his head through the door, after knocking politely. Finally, "For someone as notorious as you are, Gara, it's surprisingly difficult to find you." "Good afternoon, Professor." "I'm sorry to interrupt." He really wasn't. But Gara has another lesson and Professor McGonagall really doesn't like it when Gara ditches class. He did it often enough that McGonagall always held off on performing the register every class so that the strangely absent-minded boy could have a final chance to make it to her class. Of course, he's all yours." "It's been nice speaking to you, Gara. I'll see you again tonight for the lesson. We'll be working on your wordless casting theory, unless you would rather take the night to rest after yesterday's excitement." Gara figured he'd had more conversations since becoming mute than he'd ever had as an audible person. He didn't spare the offer of a night's rest much thought and offered no more than a nod in reply before leading Gara out of the room. Lupin was going to have to wait in his office at their usual time to see if Gara would show up. As they walked briskly towards the nearest stairwell, Draco said, "I didn't get a chance to say it last night, but well done. If one of those Weasley paupers tried to hit me with their unwashed hands, I definitely would have struck back. Especially if I had your sand. I don't suppose you could tell me how to do what you do?" Gara shook his head. "Shame. Still, I'm glad you didn't hit her back or anything. People are already avoiding you." Gara couldn't agree more. He was a little offended that people around him, even those as close as Draco, believed that he would attack a little girl at the slightest provocation. It was as if all of the personal development that he'd undergone meant nothing, as if his past was this transparent. But there still seemed to be a fundamental misunderstanding of his power floating around. "My sand isn't an offensive weapon." Gara wondered if he could get a bell, or perhaps a charm, that would alert people to when he had written out a message as the pair walked for a fair distance before Draco, uncomfortable with the silence, figuratively speaking, glanced at Gara and spotted the message. Draco couldn't believe that the sand wasn't a weapon, not for a second. However, Gara had never really seemed like the type of person that lied, but then maybe he was just exceptionally good at it. "In my home, it is called the ultimate defense. It was a shield his mother had given him, that his father had given him, that Shikaku had given him, that would protect his body from all harm, and it left his heart all the more open to pain. Now things had shifted and his heart was protected by others, as his sand stretched out to protect his precious people. It automatically responds to threats to me. With it, I can protect those I care about also." The previously self-absorbed prig, Draco thought about this as it was the exact sort of thinking he had decried Potter spouting off about for the past couple of years, but coming from Gara it seemed a lot less, for lack of a better term, courageous. From Gara it seemed more like a thoughtful ideological position rather than the idiotic default position of the lions. Draco wondered if he would, when presented by a threat to Gara, or his mother and father, or someone else close to him. No one came to mind. Would he stand up to fight on their behalf? They were quite late to class and Professor McGonagall did not accept Draco's excuse of fetching Gara or Gara's excuse of not looking her in the eye and pretending not to hear her demand an explanation. To be fair, the redhead's wasn't much of an excuse, but she still didn't press him about it. With any other teacher, letting Gara slide where she would almost definitely have given another student a tongue lashing, would have seemed like an act of cowardice of self-preservation, but with the revered lioness of Gryffindor certainly was not one to bow to fear. Especially when that fear came in the teeny-tiny package of a 13-year-old, orphaned, mute boy. Minerva didn't do anything because she had no real recourse to take. She really doubted that Gara would care if she shouted any of her well-meaning scolding at him, and he already willingly, for the most part, volunteered to spend hours after school in the presence of teacher to improve his spellcasting. She couldn't, and wouldn't corporally punish him, and it wasn't nearly severe enough to trouble the headmaster about. So she shot both Gara and Mr. Malfoy dirty looks and continued with her class, Pretending not to hear Mr. Weasley complain that now she'd also started to favor the Slytherins. It was the last official event of the year in Hogwarts for most of the students who would be returning home soon, and it was immensely important for Draco. But even with this in mind, Gara looked down through the gale and the darkness to the sodden Quidditch field that housed both the Gryffindor and Slytherin teams and considered whether Draco would even see him in the stands enough to miss him if he snuck off. From the towering wooden structure where he was sitting, the grass field might as well have been empty for all that he could see. So it was no surprise that he was the only one up there holding on to a magically reinforced umbrella with all of his strength that, thanks to the wind, didn't keep him at all dry. Weren't there deserts in this world that he could have been sent to instead of the Scottish Highlands? Through the wind he thought he could see the briefest flash of orange or gold from the bright Gryffindor uniforms, but that was swallowed up in the blink of an eye. If he saw as little of the game as he did of the opening ceremony, Gara was going to go back inside and tell Draco he had sat there for the full. How long did Draco say Quidditch matches lasted for? Before he could recall that, Draco had told him that Quidditch matches could go on for hours until the snitch was caught. He was interrupted when a shaggy black dog jumped up the final steps into the stands and trotted along to sit by his feet. Gara looked down at Sirius imperiously, thinking the man was foolish to sneak back onto the school grounds just to watch his godson's first game of the year. Derision or no, Gara's hand still absently scratched behind the soaked dog's ear as Gara finally caught a glimpse of something bright green below. He was in the right Quidditch stadium, then.
Well, that's the ending of that chapter. I do hope you enjoy this video. If you like to see more, remember to hit that like button, subscribe to this channel and leave a comment down below. Until next time.